Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling something I know a lot of you are dealing with, especially those of you leading teams.
Oh, yeah.
Gender stereotypes, how to
Yeah.
combat them, how to build a more inclusive environment.
Right.
You sent over a ton of research on this, and I got to say,
Mm-hmm.
super interesting stuff. I'm really excited to dive in and,
Yeah.
yeah, and, hopefully give our listeners some real actionable strategies.
Yeah.
Think of this deep dive as like your cheat sheet
Okay.
to building a better team.
Love it. I think what's so interesting and often missed in these conversations is that we think about tackling this as a solo mission.
Right.
But the research you sent really dives into the power
Yeah.
of collective action.
It's not just about like individual good intentions, it's about a collective shift
Exactly.
in how we think and operate, right?
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that,
Yeah.
like maybe we should start with defining what gender stereotypes actually are.
Absolutely. I think, we hear these phrases thrown around, but I think just to put it simply, gender stereotypes are oversimplified beliefs about how people should act or behave based purely on their gender. Those men are better at this or women are naturally more, these are the classic stereotypes that box people in.
Yeah, and it's not like these are just harmless generalizations. They have actual real-world consequences.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
They can impact so many things: hiring decisions, promotions, even just how people are treated in day-to-day interactions. And, all of this can really limit opportunities and really impact someone's confidence.
Yeah, and from what I was reading, it's not even just that it harms the individual, it harms the team, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it holds teams back from reaching their full potential.
Exactly. And that's why the concept of teaming up is so crucial. When we approach this as a team, we can start to see our blind spots, the things we might miss on our own.
So it's like having a diverse group of people, each with their own experience, coming together to challenge those like really deeply ingrained assumptions that we may have.
Precisely. It's about using those different viewpoints to build a more inclusive environment for everyone.
Okay, so we have our team. We've sort of defined the problem.
Okay.
Now let's get tactical.
Yeah.
Like, how do we do this? How do we tackle these stereotypes head on?
Okay.
And the research you provided had a few different approaches and strategies.
Right.
Why don't we start with education and awareness? Why is that such a critical first step?
Well, I think, it's difficult to dismantle something you don't understand.
Right.
So, education is about providing everyone on the team with a shared understanding of what these gender stereotypes are, how they manifest, and the harm that they cause.
So it's like giving everyone a crash course on the enemy.
Yeah,
We have to know what we're up against.
that's a good way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that the research digs into how education helps us uncover our own unconscious biases.
Unconscious bias. I've heard that phrase a lot, but I'm not sure I totally get it.
Yeah, I think that it's essentially the idea that we all have these mental shortcuts that we've developed over time that can lead to judgments or decisions without us even realizing it.
So it's not that people are intentionally discriminatory. It's that they have these sort of hidden patterns of thought.
Exactly. And that's why education is so crucial. It helps bring those biases to the surface so we can challenge them.
Okay, so the research is saying education, it's key.
Mm-hmm.
But just knowing about them isn't enough, right? We also need to create a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up
Absolutely.
and challenging those stereotypes
Right.
when they see them happening.
Yeah, open and honest communication.
Right.
This means creating a space where everyone feels safe to share their experiences and perspectives, even if they are different from the dominant viewpoint.
So it's creating a culture of trust
Yes.
and respect where people can have those, sometimes difficult conversations without fear of judgment or reprisal.
Precisely. And this type of open communication can be incredibly powerful. It helps us build empathy,
Yeah.
break down barriers and start to see the world through each other's eyes.
It's about understanding those lived experiences of others, not just intellectualizing the problem.
Exactly. And one of the things that really resonated with me from the materials you sent over is the emphasis on actively challenging stereotypes.
Okay.
Not just letting things slide, but actually speaking up when you see or hear something that perpetuates these harmful gender norms.
Yeah, it can be uncomfortable to call someone out, especially if it's a friend or colleague. But I'm sensing from the research that that's where the change really happens.
Exactly.
It's about interrupting that pattern.
It is, and it doesn't have to be confrontational. It can be as simple as, hey, I'm not sure that's entirely true, or offering a different perspective.
Right. Sometimes just gently nudging the conversation in a different direction can be enough.
Yeah, exactly. And what's important is to back up your challenge with concrete examples. Actually, I know several women who are amazing at that. Or, there's research that shows that's not actually the case.
So we're not just relying on feelings or opinions. We're
Right.
grounding it in,
Yes.
facts and data and research.
Exactly. And that can be much more persuasive and effective in changing minds and behaviors.
Okay, so we've talked about education, we've talked about communication, we've talked about actually challenging stereotypes in the moment.
Yeah.
What are some other strategies that teams can use to create this more inclusive environment?
Well, another key element is promoting inclusivity in all aspects of teamwork.
Okay.
This means ensuring that everyone feels like they belong and their voice matters regardless of their gender.
So it's not just avoiding the negative, it's actively creating
Absolutely.
that culture of value and respect.
Absolutely. And this can take many forms. This can be ensuring diverse representation in decision-making roles, seeking out input from a variety of perspectives, or simply creating a space where everyone feels comfortable speaking up and sharing their ideas.
Right, it's making sure everyone has a seat at the table and that all voices are heard.
Absolutely. And, one of the most effective ways to promote inclusivity is to set clear expectations for how we treat each other.
So it's like establishing a code of conduct
Exactly.
where respect and equality are like non-negotiable.
Precisely. And this isn't just about words, it's about backing those words up with actions. If someone violates those expectations, there need to be consequences.
Right, you send a message that this will not be tolerated.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the research shows that when teams establish these clear expectations and enforce them consistently, it actually leads to a more positive and productive work environment for everyone.
So it's not just about being nice.
Right.
It's actually about creating a better work environment.
It is. It's about creating a culture where everyone can thrive and do their best work.
Okay, so we've covered, education, communication, challenging stereotypes, promoting inclusivity. But how do we know if any of this works? Like, does this actually work in the real world?
That's a great question. And luckily, the research you sent over includes some inspiring case studies that demonstrate just how effective.
Yes, I love a good success story.
Yeah.
It's like seeing it in action.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at one.
Okay, I'm ready.
This case study involves a tech company that, like many in the industry, was facing challenges with gender diversity, particularly in leadership roles.
Yeah, it seems like that's a story we hear all too often.
Right.
So what makes this case study stand out? Like, what did they do differently?
Well, instead of just acknowledging the problem, they took some concrete steps to address it.
Yep.
They implemented several of the strategies we've been discussing, starting with mandatory training for all employees on unconscious bias and gender stereotypes.
So no more like business as usual. It's like, okay, this is a priority
Exactly.
for everyone.
And they also established mentorship programs. Specifically designed to support women in the company, pairing them with senior leaders who could provide guidance and advocate for their advancement.
So really trying to create that support system in that more inclusive environment.
Yeah.
Did they make any changes to their hiring processes?
Yes, they implemented blind resume screening to reduce bias in the initial screening process.
Okay.
Which, can often be where those unconscious biases can really creep in.
Yeah. It's amazing how a few key changes can make such a big difference. What were the results of all these efforts?
Well, the results were pretty impressive.
Okay.
Within a year, they saw a significant increase in the number of women being hired and promoted into leadership positions.
That's what we like to hear, like actual tangible evidence that these strategies can work.
Right.
Was it just about the numbers, or did they see any other changes within the company culture?
It was definitely more than just numbers. Employee surveys indicated a noticeable shift in the company culture. Employees, both men and women, reported feeling more included, valued, and respected.
It's an important point, right? Like creating an inclusive environment isn't just about like fixing a problem. It's about making a better workplace for everyone.
Absolutely. And the benefits extended beyond just employee morale.
Okay.
The company also reported an increase in innovation and creativity, which they attributed to the diversity of perspectives that were now being represented at the leadership level.
So win-win, right?
Yeah.
More inclusive culture, more engaged workforce, more productive.
Exactly.
I mean, it makes you wonder why more companies aren't prioritizing this.
Well, I think many companies are starting to recognize the value of diversity and inclusion, but there's definitely still work to be done. I think this case study is a great example of how taking that concrete action can lead to real, lasting change.
It's inspiring to see these success stories.
Mm.
It's like a roadmap for other teams to follow. But, let's be real. Like, changing a company culture, it's not a quick fix.
Right.
It takes time. It takes effort to shift those deeply ingrained patterns.
Exactly.
So what does the research say about sustaining these changes over time?
You're absolutely right. It's not a one-time effort.
Right.
The research emphasizes the importance of ongoing commitment
Okay.
and continuous improvement.
So it's not like you check a box and you say, okay, we solved the gender stereotype problem, moving on.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about creating a culture where challenging gender stereotypes and promoting inclusivity becomes part of the fabric of the team.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you actually do that? How do you make sure those efforts don't just fade away or lose momentum over time?
Well, one of the key recommendations is to establish regular check-ins and evaluations.
Okay.
This could involve gathering feedback from team members, analyzing data on hiring and promotions, or simply having those open discussions about how things are going.
So create that system of accountability.
Exactly.
Make sure it stays top of mind.
It's also important to celebrate those successes along the way. Acknowledge the individuals and teams that are making a difference, highlight the positive changes that are happening, and use those successes to inspire further action.
It's like what gets measured gets managed.
Exactly.
And what gets celebrated gets repeated, right?
Absolutely. And, what I found particularly interesting from the research is the role of leadership in sustaining those efforts.
Oh, that makes sense. Leaders set the tone
Right.
for the whole organization.
If leaders are truly committed to creating a more inclusive environment, that commitment will trickle down throughout the team.
So it's not just about implementing policies. It's about actually walking the walk,
Exactly.
demonstrating those values.
And it's about holding other leaders accountable
Yes.
for creating inclusive teams.
It has to be top down.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, this talk about leadership and company culture makes me think, what about those of us who aren't in leadership positions? What can we do as individuals to kind of make our teams more inclusive?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to remember that everyone has a role to play in creating a more inclusive culture.
So even if we're not the CEO, we can still make a difference.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most powerful actions are the small, everyday things that we do.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, be mindful of the language you use.
Huh?
Avoid using gendered terms or making assumptions about people based on their gender.
So be more conscious of our words and how they might be impacting others.
Exactly. And it's also about being an active listener. Really pay attention to what others are saying and be respectful of their experiences, even if they're different from your own.
Yeah, listening, that's a skill I think a lot of us could improve on.
Right. And, when you hear someone making a stereotypical remark, don't be afraid to speak up. It doesn't have to be a big confrontation. Just a simple, hey, I'm not sure I agree with that, can be enough to interrupt that pattern.
Yeah, be an ally even in those small moments.
Exactly. And another thing you can do is make an effort to include diverse voices in meetings and discussions.
Okay.
If you notice that someone isn't being heard, invite them to share their perspective.
So be proactive. Don't wait for someone else to step up.
Right. And, one of the things I found really inspiring in the research was this idea of amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized.
Who does that mean?
It's a very simple but powerful concept.
Okay.
If you hear a woman make a great point in a meeting and it seems like it's being overlooked, you can just repeat the point and give her credit.
So it's like shining a spotlight on those contributions that might otherwise be missed.
Exactly. And it can make a big difference in making sure that everyone's voice is heard and valued.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the importance of education, communication, challenging stereotypes, promoting inclusivity, sustaining change, the role of leadership, and we've heard some really inspiring examples of teams successfully implementing these strategies. But before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. What's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember from this conversation?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that creating a truly inclusive team environment is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
So it's not about achieving perfection. It's about continuous learning and growth.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more equitable and fulfilling experience for everyone.
That's a great point.
Mm.
As we've been talking about all these strategies and these case studies, it's striking to me how much of this comes back to self-awareness.
Mm.
We talked about unconscious bias earlier, and I'm wondering if we could dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
What are some practical ways that we can become more aware of those hidden biases that might be influencing our perceptions and our actions?
That's a great question. And I think, one of the most effective ways to uncover those unconscious biases is to simply pay attention to your thoughts and reactions.
Right.
Notice those moments when you make a snap judgment about someone based on their gender.
Mm-hmm.
Ask yourself, why did I think that? Where did that assumption come from?
So cultivate a sense of curiosity about your own thought processes.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful to talk to people from different backgrounds and perspectives to get their insights and challenge your own assumptions.
Right. It's easy to get stuck in our own echo chambers,
Mm,
surrounded by people who share our views, and stepping outside of that can be really eye-opening.
absolutely. Another practical tip is to pay attention to the language we use.
Okay.
Often our language reveals our unconscious biases, even if we're not aware of it. Like, for example, we might use gendered terms without even realizing it.
Yeah, it's those subtle ingrained things that we've heard our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a real conscious effort to retrain our brains.
It does. And what's really encouraging is that the research shows that with practice, we can actually rewire our brains to be more inclusive. It's not about being perfect. It's about making that conscious effort to challenge those biases and create new, more equitable patterns of thinking.
So it's like building a muscle. The more you work on it,
Exactly.
the stronger it gets.
And the great thing is that as we become more aware of our own biases, we're also better equipped to identify and challenge those biases in others.
Yeah.
It's like a ripple effect, creating a more inclusive environment for everyone.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about, how to combat these stereotypes, but about myself and my own unconscious biases. What a powerful reminder that this work really does start with each of us.
I completely agree. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it sparks some new ideas and inspiration for our listeners.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, regardless of gender, requires a collective effort. It starts with each of us being willing to examine our own biases, challenge the status quo, and advocate for change. It can feel daunting, but every small step we take, every conversation we have, every stereotype we challenge, it brings us closer to that vision.
What's really inspiring is that when we work together, when we support each other, when we amplify each other's voices, we create this force for change that is impossible to ignore.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into teaming up against gender stereotypes.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, keep learning, keep challenging, and keep pushing for a more inclusive world. Until next time, keep diving deep.